Sometimes we have talked, quite a few times we've talked about what you eat. We're much more concerned today to talk to you about something called circadian rhythms. And so I want to introduce the subject by just mentioning that virtually all animals, even insects, have circadian rhythms, and they're built into their body. Even plants have circadian rhythms. 400 years before Christ, or roughly that, people noticed that something called a mimosa tree at night folds up its leaves. During the day, they're spread out. And that was so remarkable that this ship's captain who worked for Alexander the Great recorded that fact. He observed that this plant does this weird thing. In the year 1729, a French scientist did an experiment. He took the plant and he put it where it was dark all the time. It still folds up and then unfolds on a 24-hour cycle, even when it doesn't get any light. Well, it's close to a 24-hour cycle. It's very hard for a clock to keep on perfect time without the sun or something to go by. So a scientist named Franz Hallberg in 1959 coined the term circadian. It's a Latin combination of two words, circa meaning about, and dies meaning day, circadian, about a day. So you have cycles built into your body about a day in length. Now when you consider your body, it's a pretty amazing thing. You've got about 25,000 different genes in your DNA to make proteins. Those genes actually make about 100,000 different proteins because one gene can make more than one kind of protein. There's something called alternative splicing, which allows a single genetic program for a protein to make more than one different kind of protein. And your body has ways of turning on and turning off those switches. And then, of course, your cells are making thousands of proteins every day, and those have many different interactions going on. It's completely beyond what we can understand, everything that's going on in there. And you've got, somebody took the trouble to figure it out, you got about 37.2 trillion cells in your body. And that's a pretty large number, as you obviously are aware. And 100 billion nerve cells in your brain. And you have to ask yourself, what keeps everything working smoothly? How does this thing do this? Well, it's very interesting, but there's a clock built into every cell in your body. And almost every cell in your body is using that clock to keep about a 24-hour cycle. Now, how does the clock work? Well, here's some explanation of how it works. There's a whole lot of different proteins that have to work together to make this clock work. And people have named them interesting names. One protein is called the clock protein. Another one is called the period protein, obviously having to do with time. And then there's a bunch of other proteins there. And I'm not going to try to explain to you all the details, but I'll give you a brief idea of what it works, how it works. Consider this. There are two groups of proteins, Group A and Group B. Group A is created by the cell, and it, as it gets more and more of that protein or those proteins, they tend to turn on Group B and create more of those proteins. So Group B builds up, and Group B does the opposite. It tends to turn off the making of Group A. So when you get enough Group B, it turns off the making of A. When A is turned off, Eventually it goes down, and it's no longer stimulating the creation of B, and then B goes down, and when B gets down, then A starts up again, because nothing is to stop it anymore. So it just goes through that cycle every 24 hours. Well, that's a sort of abbreviated version of what goes on in most of your cells in your body. And that reminds me of a text from Scripture, from Psalm 92. It says, "For you, Lord, have made me glad through your work. I will triumph in the works of your hands. O Lord, how great are your works. Your thoughts are very deep." And I tell you, they are very deep, because it is very much still beyond us to completely understand what is going on and how it is working. But what we know is that clocks would eventually get off time if they didn't get reset now and then, right? Well, there's a few things, on the internet you can get the time, but somebody had to set it. It has to be set every so often. So what you have is you have something we call a master timekeeper in your brain. On both sides of your brain, near the midline, right over the nerves that come from your eyes, are what are called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. Those are your master timekeepers in your body. Those cells are keeping time, and it stays on time because of the light and the dark from the sun. And when the light hits your retina, it sends messages to those timekeepers. Oh, the light's getting pretty bright. Better adjust the clock a little if we need to, and keep it on a 24-hour cycle. So that's how your body stays on a 24-hour cycle, because those master timekeepers get the sunlight, and that stimulates adjusting the clock every day to try to keep it on time. Now, the master timekeepers actually stimulate hormones in your body to go up and down with the daylight. And so here you have a picture of 3 different things that go up and down each day, and the dark area there in the middle, that's the usual time when people sleep. So that's all that represents. Not everybody sleeps then, but that's the usual time for people to sleep. So look at the red curve. You'll see there that it comes up right next to that place where people usually tend to go to sleep, and that nerve, or that curve there, sort of dives down, and that's your body temperature. Every 24 hours your body temperature is going through a cycle, and at night it's high as it's going to get usually, and that if you have a fever, that's when it's the highest. In the morning it'll tend to be lower. Your temperature goes down as you sleep. Now, up and down with the temperature, your alertness goes up and down. The higher the temperature, the more alert you are. And people have studied this. You actually are more alert just about before bedtime a little bit. And by morning, you're kind of dull. You're not too with it. And there's a good reason for that to happen, that it starts out and you're pretty alert, but often you're very tired even though you're alert. You're tired, and when you go to bed, you can go to sleep easily because you are tired. But as you get toward morning, you're more rested. You'd be ready to wake up, but your alertness has gone down and it keeps you asleep. So the whole mechanism is built there to keep you able to sleep a reasonable length of time. Otherwise, you'd be waking up in the middle of the night ready to go do something, and that wouldn't always work out wonderfully. So that's the red curve. The blue curve, also a very interesting curve, that's something called melatonin. That's a hormone your pineal gland creates, right in your brain. Deep in your brain is your pineal gland. And that produces melatonin, and it begins to produce it when it begins to get late in the day and dark. It actually doesn't do much till it gets dark. About 9 o'clock there, you'll see the melatonin starting to go up. Well, that's going to make you sleepier. And if you're careful and don't interrupt it, it will make you sleepy. You'll be ready to go to bed at a reasonable time. And that's where that curve peaks out there. You're sound asleep, and then it gets lower as you get toward morning, and then you're ready to face the day again. So that's the blue curve. And then you have the black curve, and the black curve is a hormone called cortisol, and that's very important in your body because when that level is high, that makes you ready to go out and face the world and deal with all kinds of trauma and everything of that sort. But when that level is low, that's when your body can actually heal. So if you have damage to your tissues, if you're a runner and you run hard and you've damaged your tissues because you've run so hard, then at night, as that level of cortisol gets low, that's when your body is healing and it is creating new cells. And the guy Franz Hallberg we looked at there briefly at the beginning, he did experiments and saw that the cells are dividing at their maximum rate about 9 o'clock at night in a human being. Well, he also did an interesting experiment, which we kind of went over too fast maybe. What he did is he injected mice with something called endotoxin, which is a very poisonous substance, comes from E. coli bacteria and causes septic shock. That's what kills people. You inject a mouse with some of that. If you do it at 6 in the evening, the mouse he sleeps in the day, so he's sort of groggy. He might be thinking about getting up and doing something. But if you inject him at that time, 83% of the time it will kill the mouse. But if you inject the mouse at 2 a.m. in the morning when you like to sleep, mice are up. They're active. Only 13% of them die if they're injected at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's a huge difference. 13% versus 83%. That just shows you the huge difference in the things going on in your body, the physiology, the chemicals, at the different time of the day. That's what those rhythms are doing. Many different things in your body are changing through the 24-hour cycle. And it's very important to pay attention to that. And this is just another picture. This is of the body temperature as we saw it in that red curve there. This is 3 different experimental curves sort of all put together, and that darkest curve there is the sum of all 3 of those curves. And it just shows you here that the temperature here is already falling pretty good at about 9 o'clock at night. So 9 o'clock at night's not a bad time to go to bed and go to sleep. So circadian rhythms are important. They're determined by the light and the dark cycle. They're not really directly under your control unless you go to a great deal of effort to change your light that you see. And they don't care whether you choose to sleep or eat at particular times, but they do determine the best time to sleep and the best time to eat. And that's why we're talking about this. So the best time to sleep is when your alertness has just started to go down and when your melatonin is going up, because you're going to be able to sleep longer, and you need about 8 hours of sleep to be properly refreshed, rejuvenated, ready for the day. And it's when the melatonin is going up, and the cortisol is low. Just about that time it begins to get fairly low. And when you first get in bed, easiest time to fall asleep because you're the tiredest. And if you're doing it at the right time, that just helps. And something else happens in your body at that time. This is a picture of what looks like people sleeping. This is just a chart of how they go up and down in terms of depth of sleep. So here you see on the left side here, when you first get in bed, you tend to go way down to a deep level of sleep. Levels 3 and 4 nowadays, level 3 and 4 are just lumped together. It's just slow wave sleep. That's what that is. And that is very essential for your body, and it is very rejuvenating, and that will happen when you first get in bed or get a chance to sleep. And if you don't allow yourself to sleep, at some point it's going to happen anyway. You're going to fall asleep. It's pretty hard to avoid. And then the rest of the night you'll be down in only level 2. And in level 2, your brain is doing some interesting things. It's moving traces of memory from your hippocampus to your cerebral cortex and helping you to remember things long term instead of short term. So it's very important if you're learning, or like in school, to get enough sleep. If you don't get the sleep, you're not going to remember things very well, and you're not going to do well. And then there's something called REM sleep, that these black dark bars here, and we don't know exactly what's going on during REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. If you could look at somebody's eyes during REM sleep, their eyes are darting around trying to see what's going to get them. You know, is there a lion there? And so it's just, there's a lot of activity going on in your brain, and your eyes are moving a lot, and the only reason you're not jumping around and doing things is because your brain is smart enough to paralyze your muscles so you can't move. During that kind of sleep, you hardly can move your muscles. It keeps you from thrashing around in bed and trying to escape the lion. And that's important not to do when you don't know what you're doing. It doesn't work out well if you do. So that's important. But then when you're having that deep sleep, something else is happening. Your body is putting out growth hormone. And it's just that very deep sleep that the body really pours out growth hormone. And the growth hormone poured out there helps the healing process. You probably heard of athletes taking growth hormone, trying to help themselves recover from an injury. I don't know how well that works because your body's already producing growth hormone. So if you're adding more to it, I'm not sure it helps. But your body naturally does that, and it does that during the very deepest sleep. And that's also the time when the cortisol is low, so the healing can take place. So it's very important that all that works together. Now, what if you disregard your circadian rhythms? Well, people have done interesting experiments on animals. You can do them on humans, but you can't do the same things on humans you can do on animals. So they took something called the golden hamster, and they mutated one of the proteins called the period protein. And if you do that, and you do things just right, then they don't have a rhythm anymore. They actually try to have a rhythm, but it's so out of whack with day and light, the light and dark cycle, that it doesn't end up being useful. It's just all over the map. So they really don't have a good rhythm at all, and it shortens their life by 20%. Now, golden hamsters don't live a huge lifespan. They live about 17 months. So they're about 3 months shorter is what their lifespan turns out to be. And then they did some really interesting experiments. They took normal suprachiasmatic nuclei from embryo, grafted it into the brain of the golden hamster that didn't have a rhythm, and restored the rhythm. And when the rhythm was restored, they not only lived a normal lifespan, they lived 20% longer. It's really important to have a rhythm. And why did they live 20% longer? Well, what happens to a hamster as he gets old is his suprachiasmatic nuclei tend to sort of wear down, and they're not doing as much, and the rhythm isn't as strong, and when the rhythm gets weak, they begin to fail. So putting that new tissue in there and having a new suprachiasmatic nucleus working for them that was young tissue restored that rhythm so much that they were actually living to be older than most normal hamsters live to be. And I thought I'd include a hamster for you just because I think they're really cute. And I once had a pet. I did not know he only lived 17 months, but he did die at one point, so that was too bad. Now, another thing that they have done experimentally is take mice and they mutate the clock protein in a mouse, and what they see is the mouse doesn't have a rhythm anymore, and now he's eating all the time. He doesn't know when it's day or night. You know, I mean, it is light or dark, but he doesn't pay much attention to it because he doesn't get sleepy the way normal mouse does. So he's eating a lot, and he's not sleeping very well, and he's gaining weight, and his sugar's getting out of whack, and he's becoming diabetic. So that's not so great. And then if you look at night shift workers, and by the way, this is not meant to target night shift workers. I've done my share of night shifts. It's not ideal, but somebody has to do it. But we know that these kind of health problems are a problem for night shift workers. There is more problems with weight, there's more problems with the lipid levels, there's more heart disease and cancer, and a lot of problems with the digestive tract because people just suffer more. Everything just doesn't work as well when you can't keep in sync with your rhythms. Now, they've also looked very seriously at type 2 diabetes to see what the risks are and how it relates to sleep. And they tracked over 107,000 people for 4 to 32 years, different time periods because they keep recruiting people into the study. But there was a long time period here where they watched a lot of people. And these people did not have diabetes type 2 when this study started, but before the study was over, there were like 3,500 of them had developed diabetes type 2. And here's what they found. If you sleep, it depends on the person. It's not identical for everybody, but if you sleep less than 5 or 6 hours, your increased risk for type 2 diabetes, 28% higher. If you sleep longer than 8 or 9 hours, your risk is even higher. If you can't fall asleep, it's even worse. And if you can't stay asleep, it's worse yet. So those are just the risks that they saw. Now, this is just what we call an observational study. You just look at these people to see what happens. This is not a randomized controlled study, so it's not as foolproof, but people have done randomized controlled studies, not 107,000 people. That would be a very expensive study to do, but in fewer people, and they do indeed see that if people are not sleeping as long as they should be, and they can extend their sleep, their blood sugar gets better, and their sensitivity to insulin gets better. So we're pretty sure this is really on target here. This is not just something, an oddity. Really is a risk for type 2 diabetes. So what are the conditions for best sleep? Well, people have looked at what the conditions are for good sleep, and you don't want to eat close to bedtime. About 3 hours is about as close as you want to get. And you don't want to exercise vigorously within about 3 hours of bedtime, because if you exercise, you're going to raise your body temperature. It needs to be going down, not up, if you're going to sleep. And eating also, by the way, raises your body temperature, because as you're metabolizing and digesting the food, it raises your body temperature. And there are also other things that go on when you eat. Your body has to digest that food, and that has a certain amount of work involved, and your brain gets involved with that, especially if you're doing it on an irregular schedule. So it's very much better not to try to eat close to bedtime. And then you want to worry about electronic screens. If you're talking an LED screen, Uh, that is 5 times more damaging to your melatonin level than the old yellow light bulb you used to use. Nowadays, where everybody's switching to LED, it's much more energy efficient, but it's also much harder to go to sleep if you spend time looking at those things just before bedtime. So that's something you want to try to avoid. Try to avoid emotionally charged issues near bedtime. That doesn't help. Getting your adrenaline going is just not what you want to do when you want to go to sleep. You want to be relaxed. And caffeine in the evening is a no-no. What does caffeine do? It blocks the receptors for something called adenosine. And adenosine is a substance very key in your body, everywhere in your body. Your body is using something called ATP to provide the energy. And when it provides the energy, the result is something called adenosine. And those breakdown products make you feel tired, but they have to hit a receptor to make you feel tired, and if you block the receptor with caffeine, then you don't feel tired anymore. So your brain won't want to shut down, and you keep trying to keep going, but you needed rest, but your brain doesn't know that, so it just wants to keep going. Of course, your performance goes down whether you get the rest or not. I mean, if you don't get the rest, I should say, your performance will go down because you're tired even if you don't know it. That's the problem with caffeine near bedtime. Okay. Another important thing is to have a regular bedtime. Keep the room dark because you want the melatonin, and light tends to shut down the melatonin. Keep it cool. Experts on sleep recommend about 65 degrees. That's getting easier to do now. The weather has really cooled down. And try to have a comfortable place to sleep. So those are important things if you really want to get the best sleep. And there is interesting counsel in Scripture about sleep. This is another Psalm, Psalm 127, verses 1 and 2. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, and the guards stand watch in vain. And then it says, in vain you rise early and stay up late. In other words, you're not getting your sleep. You're cutting it off at both ends. You're getting up early and staying up late, trying to make a living. Toiling for food to eat. It says, for he grants sleep to those he loves. You have to learn to trust him, do the right things, and trust him, and get your rest, because you will be better and you will do better if you get your rest. And we'll talk more about that. Now, we talked about the clock in the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and every cell has a clock in it, but virtually every organ in your body has its own clock. The whole organ is on a timer. If you want, it's going through a cycle. Generally, that's a 24-hour cycle, but it can attach to that cycle various things that might happen at different times. So your pineal gland is on a cycle, your kidneys, your heart, your adrenal cortex, your liver, pancreas, spleen, even your fat is on a cycle, believe it or not. Your intestines, even your blood vessels. People have looked to see they're on a 24-hour cycle. That's why your blood pressure tends to go down at night and go back up more in the daytime. And so that makes life work. Now, because all those organs are on a timer, if you want, when you eat turns out to be important. And so it's good to eat a regular time every day as far as possible. Nothing is perfect. Sometimes you can't do that, but as much as you can, it's helpful. Your circadian clocks will learn the timing, and the master clock keeps all those organs on the 24-hour cycle. But the organs have their own clock going. It just gets reset by the master timer to keep things in sync. And animal experiments give us interesting information about the clock in the different organs and meal timing. So people have actually looked at what happens in the body, and actually this hormone ghrelin, your stomach produces ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that makes you hungry. Normally that rises a bit before you're eating. It makes you feel hungry. Well, people have looked at animals, but they've also looked at this in humans. They take humans and they say, okay, you're used to eating on a schedule and you eat this time and this time and this time. And now we want you to go a day without eating, and we're going to measure your ghrelin level. And what we see is that about the time you would eat, just a bit before that, the ghrelin goes up. And after you would have eaten, it goes down. And at the next time you would have eaten, it goes up again, and then down again. And the same thing the third time. The body has learned when you eat meals, if you give it a chance to learn. But you have to do it on a regular schedule, or it doesn't learn because it has no clue what you're doing next. It can't figure it out because you're doing something irregular. And the other thing that happens is it takes a lot of different digestive enzymes to digest your food. Those enzymes are made by the stomach, by the intestine, by the pancreas, by the liver. All those things get involved in digesting your food. All those organs make the digestive substances ahead of time, right ready when you eat, so that your body can handle the food and digest it, and you don't have to think about it. It takes care of all that automatically. And if you don't eat on a regular schedule, then it has no clue what's coming, and when the food comes, then it has to send a signal, help, there's food down here, what shall I do with it? And your brain has to send a signal to your pancreas, get busy and make some enzymes because we got to deal with this food. So the whole thing is sort of screwed up, if you want, if you don't eat on a regular time schedule. Now, so if you do eat on a regular time schedule, the body just takes care of things automatically, and it doesn't require the higher parts of your brain to get involved in order to take care of it. And the higher parts of your brain can be involved in doing something more constructive than trying to stimulate digestive substances to be made. Now, so they've done experiments on mice. You can give mice cancer. Not a nice thing to do, but it's better to do it to mice than to people. So you can actually put some chemical on their skin, give them cancer that way, or you can graft a cancer right onto their tissue, put it into their abdomen, and they will grow a cancer. It will take off. Cancers are pretty unconcerned about where they grow as long as they get something to grow on. So what happened is people took mice and they produced what they call chronic jet lag. Well, how do you produce chronic jet lag in a mouse? Well, you put him in a cage and you turn the light on for 12 hours and then you turn it off for 12 hours. If you do that on a regular basis, then everything is great. He does his usual thing. He's up in the night when it's dark, and he's sleeping when it's light, and he's happy. But if you do this for 2 days and then you advance the active time by 8 hours, and then you do that for 2 days, and then you advance the active hours by 8 hours, then he never gets in sync with anything. So he's chronically jet lagged, and you know how you feel when you're jet lagged. Nothing is going well. You know, it just feels pretty awful. So that's how you chronically jet lag a mouse. Or you can cauterize his nuclei, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and kill those cells off so he doesn't have a timekeeper. Then he will not have a good rhythm. And either way, if you suppress the rhythm, what you see is the tumor grows faster. Here's a picture of some experimental results on these mice. So here you have a normal mouse, has a normal suprachiasmatic nucleus. Here's a mouse, it's been wiped out, that's why the negative sign there. And the tumor grew almost 3 times the weight of this tumor in the same length of time. So it's like the mouse is much weaker, he can't resist this tumor, it grows a lot faster in him. And these were 2 different kinds of tumors here. This is a pancreatic tumor here. This is something called an osteosarcoma. And here's a similar experiment. Now this LD mouse, and the tumor has grown like that. This is a normal mouse. He's getting the light and dark on the normal cycle. In the light and dark on a normal cycle, he just eats when he wants to. I mean, he eats during the dark time of day because that's when he's awake and likes to do things, but he's eating as he usually would. Here, he is not eating when he would like to. He's eating on a strict schedule. And if he eats on a strict schedule, lo and behold, the tumor doesn't grow as much. Because on a strict schedule, he has to follow rhythms. And his body can do that. And he's better off for it, even if he doesn't think so. And this is just the same experiment with a different kind of tumor. Over here is the chronic jet-lagged mouse. And what you see is normal mouse, normal light and dark, LD here, normal light and dark. Chronically jet-lagged mouse, he can't get a rhythm going, and his tumor grows bigger. But if you take the same chronically jet-lagged mouse and you give him his meals on a strict schedule, even if the light and the dark is messed up, he is improved. He has less growth of the tumor. He's more resistant to the tumor. So you see the benefit of having a strict meal schedule for that mouse. He's able to do a little better, even though his timing is not ideal. Okay, so I mentioned your time for your meals. You need to allow some time between meals because your body needs to give your digestive system a rest between meals. Well, it takes several hours to digest your food. Then you need a couple of hours of rest before you put more food down there. If you give it some rest, you'll feel better, your stomach will work better, you won't have some of the problems like people have. But if you allow 5 hours between meals, that pushes your meal times out quite a bit. It's hard to have the third one 3 hours before bedtime. So then you're between a rock and a hard place, as they say, right? So what are you going to do? Well, the best advice is if you're going to eat a third meal, make it a light meal. Don't eat heavy food. And when I say don't eat heavy food, the biggest heavy in the heavy of food is fat. Fat takes a lot of time to digest. In fact, there's a rule of thumb that appears in medical physiology textbooks. Every 10 grams of fat takes another hour to digest. How much is 10 grams of fat? About 15 almonds is 10 grams of fat. So you just have to consider if you're eating a lot of heavy food, don't do it near bedtime. It's just not a good idea because your intestinal tract will be working halfway through the night and you won't be sleeping very deeply. You'll be finding it very hard to get into that deep sleep that your body needs. Now, why is that important? Well, here's a picture of different levels of sleep. And what you see here in the deep sleep, level 3 and 4, slow wave sleep, the waves are very, very slow compared with these. So over here, when you're awake or when you're in higher stages of sleep, the nerves are signaling very rapidly. And that takes energy to do, and the nerves are very busy. They're not getting much rest. But when you get down here so over here it might be going 30 or 40 times a second. One nerve is just bang, 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 much faster than I can do bang, bang. 30 or 40 times a second. Think about that, how that nerve can even do that. Well, it's got the energy to do it, and it was built to do it, but it needs some rest now and then. And the rest happens when it's only going about once a second. And that's what's happening here. Your nerves are very much slowed down. They're just doing the minimum to keep things moving, and they're getting a chance to rest. So that's slow wave, slow signals, very slow. And I'm not trying to put you to sleep, by the way. But it allows your nerves to rest. So that's why you need that slow wave sleep. And when you first get in bed, that's the first thing your body wants to do. Give those nerves a rest. Now, what's going on in the nerves when that's happening? We don't completely understand what's going on in the nerves when that's happening, but some very interesting research has been done recently in Israel, and they have done some research which shows some, at least, of what's going on in your nerves during that very deep sleep. So that has to do with something called a zebrafish. I don't know if you ever had a zebrafish, but they're cute little things, and they are very beautiful, as you can see, and you can buy them at the store, I guess, and put them in your aquarium. But here is a baby zebrafish. Now this is a very tiny creature. They call it a larva. This is a tiny zebrafish. Its tail sticking off the screen over there. The eye is here on the left, and you see these pretty colors. Well, let me explain the colors. There's something called green fluorescent protein. It comes from a sea creature. You've probably seen some pretty pictures of sea creatures that light up in lights, pretty colors. Well, they found this protein. They take the DNA from that protein, graft it into the genome of a fish in a particular spot so it connects up with a protein that's used in a particular part of the body. And when that fish grows up, it has that protein tagging right along with that part of the tissue. So here you see the green, that's all the nerves in the fish showing up so you can see them. Well, interestingly, this fish is virtually transparent, which makes it a wonderful animal to study because you can see what's going on inside it. So you see all the nerves, and the red, well, that's a different color, similarly produced, tagging something called amyloid beta protein. And that is a key protein, people think, causing Alzheimer's disease. This fish has been converted into a model to study Alzheimer's. So the amyloid beta is the normal amyloid red. The blue down there on the right is abnormal amyloid, which might be causing some problems because it's the same problem that's seen in Alzheimer's disease. Well, that's not why I'm showing you the picture. I'm just explaining the colors. They took the same fish, they worked it so it would label chromosomes with the green. And I'm not going to show you a bunch of pictures, but I could have shown you some, but I don't want to spend all our time on that. But what they were able to see is you can take this fish alive, and fish sleep. They'll sleep for a few seconds. They're not doing anything. They're just there, and they're very unresponsive to a light or something. And they're sleeping. So you can tell when they're asleep and when they're not asleep. And they label so the chromosomes in the cells show up. And you can take a microscope, the fish is alive in there, and you focus down with a microscope, you can actually see the individual cells and their nuclei and the chromosomes labeled. And you can see what's happening to the chromosomes during sleep and when they're not sleeping. And what happens when they're sleeping is the chromosomes are doing a lot of moving around, and they're actually repairing the DNA. And during waking time, when they're doing normal things, They're getting damage from various toxins and various things in the environment. Radiation, whatever, is causing breaks in the DNA, and when they're sleeping, it's repairing the DNA when they get that sleep. So we think that's what's going on, even in humans, part of what's going on when you're in that deep sleep. All right. So it's important to get it. Now, so what about how many meals a day? Well, you could just eat 2 meals a day. It would actually be easier to do that and get good sleep, and actually could be helpful. And this is a statement from a medical physiology textbook. It happens to be the one I studied out of when I went to medical school. That's why it's dated 1971. But it's still an interesting book. So the statement, perhaps the most common psychogenic factor contributing to obesity, is the prevalent idea that healthy eating habits require 3 meals a day, and that each meal must be filling. Children are forced into this habit by overly solicitous parents, and the children continue to practice it throughout life. Well, interesting statement, I thought. And then there's an interesting thing in Scripture. There was this guy named Elijah who actually rebuked a wicked king called Ahab. And after he rebuked the wicked king, the king wanted to find him and kill him, of course. And God said to Elijah, go stay by this brook, this stream of water there on the east side of the Jordan River. And so he went there and stayed, and it says the Lord fed him, or it says the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. God put him on a 2-meal-a-day plan. So must be something people could do, and some people have done it and found it very helpful. Actually, our former pastor here, Pastor Debbie Isley, is on a 2-meal plan. She's been that way ever since she was our pastor, and before, I'm sure. I just don't know when she started that. And so I'm just going to tell you a few things about my own experience. This is my son's experience. Bonnie and I live right where we lived when my son came to live with us, my youngest son, and he was there going to the University of Maryland, and he was struggling a bit and up all hours of the night and that sort of thing. So I told him, if you would follow a regular time to eat and a regular time to go to bed and get up, you would really benefit. And here's what I'll do. If you'll do that, if you'll just give this a trial for 1/4 of your school, 3 months roughly, if you'll just do that, I'll give you $1,000. I believe in bribery. And he agreed to do that, maybe not surprising. And we agreed on when he would go to bed, that he would eat regular meals. And he did that. He actually found it very helpful. He began to do better. He finished up no problem, has a good job, and is thankful. That's a key too, by the way. Not everybody's thankful when you try to intervene in their lives. Later on, he began to notice that he had a bit more of him than he wanted. And so he decided he would try 2 meals a day. And he did it. He lost 25 pounds. And he has continued, as far as I know, he's still doing that. And he finds it very helpful. Now, it's not always easy because not everybody wants to be on a 2-meal-a-day plan. So if you're part of a family, that could be a little tricky. But if it works for you, it's great. Debbie Isley and her husband both do it, so it's not a problem. You just get up at your normal time, but you don't eat quite as early usually, and then you eat a little later in the afternoon, early afternoon, and then you don't eat again. And that is a very comfortable schedule. I tried it. I was doing just great until I began losing weight, and I'm already thin enough, I'm told. And so I gave that up. But if it works for you, and it can be very helpful. Now, there's a guy named Dr. Mervin Harding. He's now dead, but he was a teacher at the medical school, Loma Linda University, where I went to school. I never encountered him, but he was a teacher there, and he counseled medical students, and he wrote some of his experiences. And one of his experiences is he was counseling medical students, and I'm sure this probably happened more than once. A young student came in, and he had started out what seemed like pretty good, but wasn't too long, and he was in deep trouble. And if you get in deep trouble in medical school, guess what happens? They're not just going to move you on, just social pass. They don't do that in medical school. So he was faced with either doing better or getting out, one or the other. So Dr. Harding said, I prescribed 7 hours of sleep a night for him, and at least 30 minutes of exercise every day. And he didn't want to do it, but he reluctantly agreed to do that. He didn't want to do it because he thought he needed all his time to study. He didn't have time to sleep, maybe till midnight or later, and he didn't have time to exercise because there was so much to learn that he had to study full time. Well, that wasn't working. But when he took this advice, by the end of the year, he was in the top third of his class. That's quite a switch for somebody in medical school. And indeed, they do kill you if they can. I can swear to that. I could have studied full-time 24 hours a day if I could have, but I couldn't. Can't really survive doing that. Even fruit flies will die if you don't let them sleep. Maybe that's a way to get rid of fruit flies, but I don't think it works. I'm not going to stay up 24 hours chasing fruit flies. Now, people have studied medical residents and interns to see what happens because they're known for not getting a lot of sleep. When I was an intern and a resident, well, I remember as an intern, that was the cruelest time I can remember. We had a time when we went to work, we worked the day, we were on that night, and this was a busy county hospital, so we worked all night. And then we worked the next day because we had to take care of our patients until we were exhausted to the point of dropping, and then we could go home maybe 6 or 7 o'clock if things went well. And so that's like 36 hours, no sleep. Well, let me tell you, things aren't working well by the time you get to the end of that. So they've actually taken and tested these people who are doing this, and they have really poor reaction time, their memory is not good, they have poor judgment, and one of the reasons they've changed the law so now they have to allow them to sleep more is because people are getting killed by these interns and residents who mean to do the right thing but just can't quite put it together when they've been awake so long. And if you look at driving, anywhere from 10 to 30% of accidents are due to lack of sleep. Depends on what country you're getting your figures from, but there's a lot of accidents that happen due to lack of sleep. And so there's various theories about how much sleep you need and what's a problem. And there was a hypothesis called the sleep debt hypothesis, and if you don't get sleep, you build up a sleep debt every hour that you don't get. If you don't get 8 hours, you get less, then maybe you're building up a sleep debt. And that sort of, works in terms of explaining things. There was something called the core sleep hypothesis. If you just get 6 hours a night, you'll be okay, you'll get used to it. We know that's false. And then there is a theory called excess wakefulness hypothesis, and that seems to be probably the easiest way to think about sleep and how much you need. People are somewhat different, but it's not hugely different. It's within an hour of 16 hours. If you stay up longer than 16 hours, your performance begins to go down linearly. with time. You just aren't able to do things that you otherwise could do. And here is a picture of, on the left, alcohol level and what happens to your performance. Well, it looks like a little alcohol might loosen you up and you're doing better here. Not a whole lot, however, but by the time you get a little more, things are going downhill real fast. Well, over here is sleep. And you're not too bad here, not that many hours awake, but by the time you are about 16 hours, roughly, you're beginning to be impaired. You're at a blood alcohol of about 0.06, and by the time you're 20 hours, you're about drunk. So the people who did the research for this said it's really hard to get these legislators to understand the fact that sleepiness is a bad thing. If we can put it in terms of alcohol level, they'll understand. Makes sense. And that's sort of helps people understand you really can't drive and do certain things in a reasonable way unless you get enough sleep. My own experience, I've worked a lot of shifts as an intern and a resident, and I can swear I was impaired. I would appear at morning report, and I was really having trouble because it's really hard to think fast when you're really tired. Just the way it was. Well, I managed to get through and survive. Some people drank coffee. I didn't believe in drinking coffee. I figured if I needed rest, my body would tell me, and I would at least know what it was telling me. And so I got rest when I could. And then I worked nights at a hospital for a year before I came to NIH as a fellow. And they had an interesting schedule of try to help you. It wasn't too wonderful, but it sort of worked. And but I remember I used to work a night a week, even when I was here in D.C., and work a night, go to work the next morning instead of sleeping. And not sure the government got their full money's worth out of me because I was not hitting on all cylinders, I don't think. But I even worked full-time after I was a fellow. I worked in the emergency room, and I used to do the night shift. They paid me more for the night shift. I thought, that's good. I like to get paid more. I will work the night shift. The problem with working the night shift is you really like to have a life outside of the emergency room. And people don't spend their nights doing much other than sleeping, most of them. So you got to switch every week on the weekend so you can have a life maybe. And that really is hard to do. That doesn't work. And actually it wasn't too bad when I had a basement apartment. I could sleep in a cool, dark, quiet place. But I made the mistake of moving. They wanted to sell the place. I had to move out. I made the mistake of moving from a cool, dark basement to a fourth floor, top level apartment. And there the air conditioning wouldn't keep the place cool if you ran it full time. So I was too hot, couldn't sleep. It was just a wretched business. So I don't recommend that. Well, my experience in trying to keep regular hours is when I met my good wife, Bonnie, I told her, if we can have breakfast at the same time every morning, I'll fix breakfast. She took me up on it, which I was glad for. And the benefit was, she used to have headaches every Monday. She no longer had headaches every Monday once we started doing that. And if you consult a headache expert, they will tell you one of the things you can do for headaches, get on a regular time schedule. Get on a regular schedule. And so we have a pretty regular schedule, and sometimes that's inconvenient, but it does pay off. And we've already talked about the number of meals. So we just try to eat a light meal in the evening, and that works pretty well. Now, just a few words about your brain. I work as a researcher. I worked for about 26 years at NIH doing research. I still consult there 2 days a week as a research person. And so for me, if my brain is not doing top level functioning, it's not going to work for me. I have to keep it working as best as I can get it to work. So if you're concerned about how well your brain is working, then you might even spend a little time thinking about how does the brain work anyway. Well, the brain is a totally amazing thing. You might not realize it, but your brain processes the left side of your visual field on the right side of your brain, and the right side of your visual field on the left side of your brain. Now, let me ask you a question. How on the earth does it look like there's no division there at all? How do those two parts of your brain keep everything looking like there was no problem with two sides of the brain? I cannot tell you. I don't know. But it's amazing what the brain can do. And so a huge amount goes on in your brain. You don't even have a clue it's happening. And one of the things that goes on in your brain is you problem solve in your brain, and you don't even know what's going on. It's subconscious. It happens without you knowing it. And suddenly a bright idea comes how to solve that problem that you had thought about 3 weeks ago and couldn't solve. And now you have insight that you didn't have before. So it's all subconscious. But let me say this. In order for that activity to go on in there, there has to not be a distraction of the system. Like if you get sick, then your brain spends time computing about sickness and trying to how to get you well. So you got to be healthy, and it can't be saying, oh, you know, I ate this candy bar and now something's got to happen here, so the brain has to be distracted to deal with it. So the more regular, and so that automatically the body takes care of it and doesn't have to ask the brain, what do I do next? So if you can keep things in sync with a rhythm, your brain is going to have the energy it needs. It's not diverted to some corrective action. It can actually spend time working, trying to solve problems and do creative things for you. Well, you're not even aware it's going on. And we have something called formal reasoning, and it's all done with symbols on paper, but that's not how your brain works. We know that. It doesn't do that. It's all basically subconscious. And the only time you really get into trying to figure out what's going on is when things aren't working automatically and you try to see if you can somehow put the pieces together. So if you want the best action, you have to take care of your body, and the rhythms have to be in sync. And that will be the time, I do believe, when you'll be most creative. And so I recommend that. And you're going to find everything is smoother.